you depressed. I get depressed when I don't eat.
Well, it's morning.
No, I get shaky if I don't eat for too long though. So if it's more than a few hours, I start getting shaky. I usually carry like a music.
Oh, we're live. We're on.
Excuse us. Hello and welcome to QuaranCon2022. This panel is all about how to write a satisfying and compelling subplot romance. So romance subplots are all over the place in fantasy, but while most fantasy authors are pretty well versed in things like world building and combat writing, there are few of us who have made a serious study of romance writing. So what goes into crafting a believable romance? What is the difference between romantic tension and sexual tension? What is chemistry and how is it evoked on page? All the authors joining us today have so much hard-earned knowledge on this topic, and I've learned an incredible amount from them, and can't wait to pull out all the good things they have to say on this topic. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Don't forget to check out the free and 99-cent book sale, which features, I hear, over 1,000 books on sale from many of the participating authors. You should feel free to drop any questions in the comment box here on YouTube, and we will try to get to them as we go. I see Britty Bear says hi. Hi. But do remember to adhere to the QuaranCon Code of Conduct as you do so. And you can find that as well as information on other panels, on the anthology, on the merchandise store. All that is on the website at www.QuaranCon2020.com. All right. So first of all, why don't we get everybody to introduce themselves? Why don't you go first, Angela?
Okay, yeah. I'm A.G. Marshall. You can call me Angela. I write the Fairy Tale Adventure series, the Solarian Chronicles, and a whole host of short stories, as well as a gamelit romantic comedy co-written with Tao Wong. So, wide variety of experiences in fantasy, sci-fi, gamelit. All of it has romance, though. The question, should it have romance? The answer is yes in my book. So.
Great. How about you, Wendy?
Okay, so I'm W.R. Gingell. You can call me Wendy. It's a lot easier to say than W.R. Like Angela, I write a vast variety of different genres. It's one of the things I really love about being indie. So I do a little bit of science fiction, time travel weirdness. I do fantasy, retold fairy tales, a lot of those usually turned on their head, and I do urban fantasy, in particular Australian urban fantasy. Some of you might know of my City Between series. Other than that, I have my Two Monarchy series, which is again just retold fairy tales. I tend to almost always write with a romance subplot. I tend not to let it take over the story too much, but I've also written 2 romances. Fantasy romance for sure, so I'm still not entirely just romance, but I do find that if there's a subplot of romance, it does make me happy, but I'm just as happy without it as well. So I'm sort of on the fence about romance in books. I like them with, I like them without, and when I write, I typically write with a subplot rather than a main focus of romance.
Stella?
Hi, I'm Stella Dorthwany. I am the author of the legendary magic duology, as well as a historical fantasy set in the ancient Persian Empire. And I am all about the romance. In fact, as I was preparing for this panel, I was sort of thinking about the term subplot and whether that actually applied to the romance in my books, because it does tend to be very prominent. And I think of my stuff as being maybe like half adventure, half romance. So I also under a separate pen name have 2 actual romance novels. So I am deep into the romance culture.
Intisar?
My name is Intisar Khanani, and I have a YA epic fantasy series in process called the Sunbolt Chronicles, which has almost no romance in it as yet. It may develop, but I don't know. I haven't gotten there yet. And then I also have the Dauntless Path books, and that is like so many people here. The first one is a fairy tale retelling called Thorn. has a very slow burn romance, if you can call it that. And then The Theft of Sunlight has a setup for romance. And I think I got invited here because the sequel, which is coming out in July, which Suzannah has read, was a very broken romance when Suzannah read it. And had a great deal of fun figuring out how to make it work. So I definitely am heavy on the fantasy and lighter on the romance, but I love that aspect. I love reading romances as well as fantasy romances and romance subplots. So I'm excited to be here and chat about all of it with you guys.
I have to say, you're doing yourself down though, Intisar, because all of your books I've ever read have like chemistry coming out the ears. Maybe less romance, but so much chemistry, and it's one of the delightful things about reading your books. So I enjoy that. I'm Suzannah Rowntree, and I'm an author of historical fantasy of various different flavors. My two main flavors going at the moment are the Watchers of Outremer series, which is gritty, epic historical fantasy set during the 200-year history of the medieval Crusader states. So, and that generally has a bit of a romantic subplot, though not always. And then I also have my fun, witty gas lamp romps in 1890s Europe ruled by monsters with like mad inventors and werewolves and fun stuff like that. And that is quite a bit more romantic. And I've had to learn a lot, mostly from these ladies, about how to write that sort of thing. And I'm moderating this panel too. That's also an important piece of information you might need to do. Okay.
I thought you were just a take charge type, Suzannah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm that too. So our first question for today is, when should you include a romantic subplot in your fantasy novel, and when should you not? So I don't know who wants to start with that. Why don't we ask Stella? You're on the spot.
All right, it's okay. I wrote down an answer to this one, but no, I mean, I think the basic answer, and this is going to sound a little bit obvious, but I think the sort of lovely thing about romance is it can fit with almost any kind of story, and so I would say the answer to that question is simply when you want to, right? If you want to add romance to your novel, then I think you absolutely should. And sort of the flip side of that is if you don't want to write romance, then don't put it in under any sort of sense of obligation or sort of idea that, oh, well, you know, such and so audience doesn't usually like my type of book, but I'll just throw a romantic subplot in and maybe I'll get some new readers. And I think that is always a mistake. And so that honestly would be sort of my straightforward answer. Beyond that, though, I would say romantic subplots can be really useful for books that are very external in nature, right? So maybe a book that has a very big overarching political plot, right? Or that has a lot of action in it, right? But any book where the bulk of the plot is happening externally, I think can benefit from a romantic subplot because that adds some internal layering and some emotional layering to what's going on.
Well, gee, Stella, I've got nothing left to say.
Yeah, I know, that was amazing.
Yeah, and I have to agree with the whole, like, when I mean, the thing about romance, right, is it is that internal arc. A lot of times it's about, there's an emotional arc of development that happens over the course of that romance. And so if you've got the external plot and there's not a lot of emotional change for your character, maybe that developing relationship is how it comes about. Maybe not. So again, don't push it in there if it doesn't belong there. But maybe it, maybe it is an aspect of how your character changes and develops. I probably shouldn't go into the things I don't like yet, right? Save that for later.
Well, when should you not is part of the question.
Oh, that's true.
I mean, I really dislike it when the romance is just a thing that is there and it doesn't affect the plot. It doesn't affect the character's development. It's just kind of window dressing. I see it a lot of times with male heroes who are the point of view characters, and the female is just there to show that he's succeeded. And it's not really a romance, you know, in that sense. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what actually makes a romance. But it's just like, it's like, yeah, this is the trophy thing you get because that's success, and that is not a romance, and let's just leave that out. We don't need that, you know. Give the guy a trophy some other way.
Yeah, the whole like woman as a prize thing, which when we're doing, you know, like these medieval type cultures, you know, which a lot of fantasy is,
yeah,
it kind of makes sense, but also like, guys, I think we can be done with it.
Done with it.
No, like it's been done enough. It's not adding much.
I mean, in fact, if you're writing that kind of a story, then it becomes a much more challenging thing to write a true romance, because there's a lot that the characters have to work through and get around because of how people are valued. So
yeah, I
And
mean,
the whole point of the romance.
If we're gonna turn it into like an arranged marriage trope, then that's good. That's cool. Yeah, we can do that.
I'm down for that.
and I'm going to interpose here and say the important part of the arranged marriage trope is realizing that you would have chosen this person if you had the choice.
Because otherwise it sucks.
Exactly.
Actually, a lot of... Oh, sorry, Suzannah, I'll cut you off. Well, a lot of what I wanted to say about this actually reflects directly off what Stella and Intisar have already said. In the Stella said earlier, you shouldn't just write a romance subplot just because it's the thing to do or you're trying to engage readers. I've seen people on author boards, and I hate to generalize, but it is mostly men saying, oh, I'm writing romance because it sells, but I think it's absolutely tawdry and silly. And I just want you to know that your disdain comes through. Like, it doesn't just come through when you're talking to other authors. If you're an author who does this, your disdain is coming through to the readers as well. The way you look at people who think of romance as a legitimate plot and or subplot, it comes through in your books because you can't hide that sort of thing. It's yourself writing. And so I really agree with Stella when she says you don't write it just for the sake of writing it or because it's popular. You write it because it serves the story or because it's something you really want to write about. And I loved what Intisar said earlier as well about women being used as a trophy. Again, particularly in male-led things, it's a huge reason. It's one of the big things as to why I think romance should be as a subplot and also why it shouldn't, in that romance is an extremely legitimate story form. It's the ultimate story. It's actually the ultimate story. As a Christian, that influences my worldview, obviously, and love as the most ultimate story is the thing. The thing is, it's not the only story. So while I think it's legitimate, I think there are times when your story is best served by not having a romantic subplot or romance.
Yeah.
She seems to have
Gotten frozen.
broken up a little.
Yeah. I'll actually jump in here while we're waiting for Wendy to come back. And because I did have one other thought I wanted to add while we're talking about times when you should not add a romantic subplot. And I think very occasionally, I will read a book where there's a romantic subplot and there's not anything wrong with it per se, but the book is actually already too crowded. And usually this happens and I think it especially happens in shorter books, right? So like if you're writing a YA or something like that, if there's already another crucial relationship happening where that is pulling the character through intense internal and personal development, then you might actually not have space for a romance. And you don't want to include it if the reader's actually going to be like paging ahead, like, oh, I'm not interested in the romance. I want to read about this other relationship. I remember in particular, there was a manuscript that I beta read for somebody I was in a contest with. And there were 2 relationship arcs in the book that the protagonist was participating in. And one was an enemies to best friends arc with another woman, and one was a love arc with the sort of male love interest. And I was so much more interested in the enemies to best friends arc. And I actually, that was sort of the feedback that I gave her, was I said, get rid of the romance, which I never say because I love romance, but I was getting that wonderful internal layering from another source. And so the second subplot was just superfluous.
Yeah. Wendy, did you have comments that remained?
Where did I get cut off? Because I noticed everybody froze and then my internet was gone. So I don't know how much you heard of anything that I said, or if I was just talking to myself for like 10 minutes.
We got most of it, I think, because you reconnected just maybe 30 seconds after you were cut off for us.
Okay. Well, I think I had a last point that I wanted to make after saying that romantic love wasn't the only valid form.
Yes.
And it was that romance as a subplot rather than the main theme of a book means that your character is able, especially in female-led fantasy, male fantasy and male with romance subplots are allowed to do other things. They're allowed to have other interests that don't involve their romantic interests. They're allowed to save the world. They're allowed to have a full life outside the romance of the book. Whereas I feel like female-led fantasy is expected to make their entire world about their romance and about their man. And while that's a valid story to tell, I do think it's a legitimate story to tell. Women should be allowed to have and be encouraged to have interests outside romantic love. You want to have a fully rounded life. Mm-hmm. So when I write, I like to write a fully rounded person and a fully rounded story where your female protagonist is able to have goals and desires that don't exist only in the male lead. So I want to give her a reason to live that doesn't involve, I must have this man or I die. And that's basically a lot of the reason why I write romance as a subplot rather than the main thing, unless I want to say something particularly about this form of love or this relationship. I will have it always as a subplot or not at all, because I want to show that it's okay for you to be a person in your own right without a man, although having a man is a delightful and wonderful thing.
I would add that one of the reasons to include romance as a subplot is one of the really special things about this way of writing romance is that it does provide you with an opportunity to take a lot of time to develop the romance and make it really convincing and really convince your audience that these two characters know each other and care for each other in ways that go beyond like sort of the instant sexual attraction that I feel often gets used as a shorthand for romantic attraction. I also really agree with Stella. When I have not included a romantic subplot in my books, it's for various different reasons. One of them was thematic. The whole theme of the book was about the fact that male and female characters and, and men and women and, people of different genders can have relationships with each other, meaningful relationships with each other, even if it's not romantic and not sexual. And it would have distracted from the theme of that book if I had had a romance in it. Instead, I just focused on male and female friendships.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that it's like it's a tool in your toolbox, right? So like, know your theme, know what you're trying to say, and does a romance serve that or not? If it's, the thing that came to my mind was like some kind of military plot, right, where they're like in danger every minute and like they have this very clear goal.
Right. So that's another example. Like that's another example from a book that I recently wrote that doesn't have a romance in it. It takes place over a short period of time during an intense an intensely dangerous situation where the two characters, you know, the main character and the only other person who could possibly be a love interest for him, those two characters are very hostile. And so it doesn't make sense to be able to cram a romantic subplot into that story. It wouldn't be convincing given who the characters are and what they're in the middle of. Like, it's enough of a challenge just to get them to work together to survive.
I have a similar story that I'm actually sharing on a month-by-month basis with my newsletter, which when I first was starting to draft it, I was like, I'm writing an enemies to lovers story. And then I wrote the thing and I was like, like, this is enemies to allies. Maybe there's hope of more. Right? But because they are so staunchly against each other for very good reasons for the majority of the story, like when we get to the end and they're kind of forced into allying each other, which, you know, hopefully that's not a big spoiler. You know,
for enemies to
you
love
can't. But you can't force the full development of the romance at that point. Like, it's too much. And so that it became a different story from what I was set out to write, simply because it needed to be something else. I think that's really, it's a really good point that you have to listen to and see how much space your story has to develop what you're going for. And then Wendy, you were talking about, you know, how a lot of women aren't afforded the right to have these stories that don't have the be all and end all, you know, romantic relationship. And that's 100% why I wrote. I mean, I literally set out to write the Sunbolt Chronicles going, I'm going to give a girl a whole lot of adventures where she's saving the world and she didn't care about a guy. and if there is a guy at the end, it just kind of works out in the last book, but it's not the point of the series.
That's what I really love about Sunbolt, actually, and reading that. A lot of my enjoyment was from that. It's just, yeah, I actually, when you were talking about your enemies to lovers, I wanted to add to that a lot of the time I struggle with suspension of disbelief when it comes to not necessarily enemies to lovers, because I actually enjoy that trope reasonably well. So long as you don't have the guy smacking the girl on the butt with his sword, that always irritates me. Yeah, but I just feel like to have people in a bad situation forced together, that always makes me think, how does this end? When you get out of this situation, well, you know, what is this really going to last? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it does, though. Like, again, the fantasy setting, you have all these reasons to be enemies that you can work with.
Yeah.
That particular trope does work well, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next question.
You want us to cover more than one question, Suzanne?
Yeah, what?
I'm sorry, this is ridiculous, I know. Actually, we're just going to cruise right over to this one. What are your 2 or 3 must-have ingredients for a good romantic subplot? And I reckon I'll get Angela to take this one away.
Okay, yeah. So it's hard to boil it down. I think for me, I'm looking to create trust and like getting on the same team. Really, that's the main one for me. If I can get them to kind of see eye to eye, then we've got it. And I try to do that through like small moments, and that's what I love in reading as well. Just like, oh, like you saw me, you saw what I needed, and you gave me that. Not like some generic nice gesture, but like, so in Leveled Up Love, the game lit romantic comedy, they make each other spreadsheets because they're like very, very nerdy, data-driven people. And so like that was like the moment, like they go on a picnic and he pulls out his laptop and he's like, I made you a spreadsheet, and she's really into it. And that's like, I'm like so proud of that moment. So I'm like, yes, this is when we knew.
It's that feeling of being seen and understood. And if you're not seen and understood in your romance, then how can you have a relationship with that person? With me, I feel the same as Angela. A lot of what I put into my romance is there has to be small moments of trust, or small moments where this person sees the other person, the actual person, instead of maybe the facade they've put up, or just maybe instead of what everyone else sees, they see and they don't just see, they understand, and they don't just see and understand, they act, which means that they're invested, but it also means that they're capable of having a relationship, which to my mind is what makes such a satisfying romance. You can't just, for me, if it's just the sexual tension, it's empty for me. Like, I can understand the appeal of sexual tension, but for me it needs to have a foundation of the proper romantic tension, the trust and the giving and the taking. Because for me, a lot of the time, for me, when it comes to romance especially, I found out that for myself as a person, I have to feel like I not only trust the person in order to give stuff, but to accept stuff from them. If I don't trust them, I can't accept things from them, whether it comes to help or gifts or whatever it may be. And I find that that translates well to the page as well. So I tend to put things, just small things like that in as well. And I find that that helps to add layer and depth to the romance.
Can you give an example of a trust moment from one of your romances?
Oh, okay. So
I really put you on the spot.
Yeah, I can never remember like specific things. I as I'm crafting them at the moment, I'm highly gleeful about them, and I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted to do. And yeah, if you ask me about them later, I'm like, I don't remember.
I remember one from one of Wendy's books. No.
Yeah,
but
you.
In your City Between series, and I'm actually going to word this so as not to give away, because who the love interest is going to become is actually not entirely clear in the beginning of the series. But when the protagonist and the love interest, as trust slowly grows between them, they sit together close on the couch and they share warmth with each other. And that is like a major symbol of the trust that has grown between them.
Yeah, I tend to do
a lot about
physical touch and closeness, being that because I don't like people touching me. So for me, that is actually a really big thing, and that tends to come out a lot in Pet, I find.
Yeah, I was going to say I've learned a lot from Stella about not only trust, but also tension and how that interplays in a romance. So would you like to talk about that?
Talk about tension or talk about like my top requirements in a romance?
Oh, talk about it all. Go on.
Oh, okay.
Go off.
Right. So yeah, Wendy likes to talk about crafting a romantic subplot with building moments of trust. And I sort of think of it in a little bit different way. I think of it as building moments of tension, where the coming to where if here, sorry, I talk with my hands a lot. So right, so like these are the two members of your romantic pairing, right? And they're traveling along, right? And they kind of come together, but there's tension, right? And they can't quite come together. So then they veer apart again. And then they come, right? The tension is both pulling them together and forcing them back apart again. That was probably like not helpful at all. So I'm actually just going to go back to the question I prepared to answer. Sorry, you guys.
Please do. Sorry.
I have 4 small children, and sometimes my thoughts are not as organized as I'd like to be. Okay, but I would say
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think you need to cut yourself a little slack.
okay, well, thank you. I just suddenly like saw my fingers like going on the Zoom screen. But perhaps actually my number one requirement in a romantic subplot does speak to the idea of tension, because I would say the number one thing I have to have in a successful subplot is pain. For me, the power of a romance comes from the pain that is felt by at least one, but preferably both members of the romantic pairing. And it is the ability of them to speak, first, the vulnerability required to allow somebody else to see your pain, and then the ability of the other one to speak into that pain. That for me creates the power of the relationship. And so in in my first Legendary Magic book, for example, the couple, they are in an arranged marriage and they are magically linked, which is a fairly common idea, I think, in romantic fantasy. But what happens is through this link, the member of the couple who is very resistant to emotional sharing is in fact forced to reveal his pain, unwillingly so, until, as we like sort of build through these moments of tension, he comes to a point where he's faced with a choice where he can either just totally destroy what's between them, or he can, rather than forced, choose to reveal his pain. And it's like the climactic moment of the book.
And then it ends in tragedy, right?
It's not I don't write tragic love stories.
Really great. I think that's actually a really great illustration of the different kinds of romance as well. Stella writes very different romances to what I write, like extremely different. For her, it is about the tension and the pain, and I do an inverted version of that, where it's a drawing closer and a drawing closer. And I think depending on what type of romances you like, you're always going to struggle with other kind of romances, either writing or reading them. But I love the way you describe that, Stella, because it's like a huge just example of how differently you can write romances.
Intisar, what about you? You haven't answered the question.
Well, I agree with a lot that has been said. I think the only thing I would add that hasn't been mentioned yet is the idea of respect. And this can be tied up in trust, right? But I don't buy romance where the two people involved, whatever their gender, don't deeply respect each other. And you can start out not respecting each other, right? Like, I mean, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, like they do not respect each other. And that's part of that tension, right? As Stella mentioned, with that story, is because they're changing over the course of the story and they each develop a very deep and abiding respect for each other. And that's a lot of what that story is about, is how they change themselves as they gain respect for the other person and deeply and ardently admire them. But I
love about Thorn, your Thorn. That was the thing that caught me with that. But like, I love so much about that book, but that deep and abiding and learning respect, that was just the most beautiful thing about that. It was perfect.
Thank you so
Everything
much.
I love in romance.
Thank you. So
yeah, for me, the two most important ingredients for a good romantic subplot, I would say, are reasons. And I think my approach sort of takes both Stella's and Wendy's approaches and sort of holds them in balance, because for me, there absolutely needs to be a compelling reason pulling the characters together, as well as a compelling reason that's pulling them apart. And you need both of those reasons to be as strong as possible. And story is driven by conflict, right? And so romance is driven by the conflict between the forces of attraction and the forces of repulsion, right? Will the forces of attraction prove stronger than the forces of repulsion? And that's kind of the question that the romantic subplot deals with. So in a lot of romances that I've read, subplot or otherwise, the compelling reason that's pulling the characters together is just like raw sexual attraction. But I like to see like a slightly more full-orbed attraction. In one of my books, it's loneliness. Like the two characters are they're deeply lonely. They're completely cut off from any kind of support network in a context where you have to have a support network or you're like starving. And so they have to become each other's only means of support, which is complicated because they're also on opposite sides of a war. So you've got that push and that pull.
Yeah.
Or another couple that I wrote, the female lead
tell
was
us which books, Suzannah.
Oh, that was A Wind from the Wilderness.
Yep.
and then in one of my Gaslamp series, I took a slightly different tack where the female lead is somebody who lives a pretty exciting and adventurous life on the outskirts of society. The male lead is this starchy and law-abiding policeman type, and they see each other and they're attracted to each other because each of them has something that the other lacks. Like, he's got stability, she's got some excitement to her life, and they both gravitate towards that. But it also pulls, that very thing that pulls them together is also the very same thing that's standing in the way of them finding romantic harmony. So I would say you absolutely have to know what those reasons are for each of your characters, and and it has, those reasons have to be unique. The reason drawing your protagonist to the love interest and vice versa needs to be something that they can't get from anyone else in the book. Let me see what else. Oh yeah. I also think it's important, like if you're writing in a specific character's point of view and the love interest doesn't get a point of view, like it's important to have the other person whose head you're not writing from inside. It's important to have that other person express or communicate in some way exactly their reason for being drawn towards the protagonist. And I often do that in dialogue, like, my life was so boring before you turned up, something like that, like translation, you know, I'm drawn to the excitement that you bring to my life, that kind of thing. And I mentioned that because it's something that I think a lot of people seem to skip, especially if the love interest is of the opposite sex to the author and their protagonist. It can be quite jarring as a female writer to read something by a man where the woman is just throwing herself at the protagonist for no apparent reason. Oh, you know, he's good looking and he's fighting for her throne. Well, she's actually surrounded by good looking warriors who are fighting for her throne. What's different about him?
Well, he survived. The rest are dead, Suzannah.
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, if he's the main character, he has to get the girl. I mean, come on.
Okay, so that was just me going off on that question. Let's move on to the next one. How do you create chemistry between characters? Intisar, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, start with me.
But you do it all the time.
Oh no, this is like the one question I didn't really prep very well, because I was like, I don't know, how do I do that? I think for me a lot of it boils down to that deep relationship, right? So the chemistry for my characters doesn't start until that respect kicks in and those moments of trust start happening, and then there is so I am obviously not an insta love author. This is about that slow burn. This is about discovering that this person that you may or may not have even thought of as, you know, worth talking to, is someone that that is holding your interest, and that you start developing a relationship with them that is based in not in I don't know how to say this. It's very much, based in respect, but it's also based in like these deeper needs, and kind of recognizing, as you said, Suzannah, that you are filling a need and that they are filling a need. And as you start to see each other, I think for me, that's where the chemistry really kind of kicks in, is because there's nothing more sexy to me than people who see each other and embrace each other and can be a shelter for each other or a support for each other. And when that starts happening, I think the rest just kind of comes together for me. And I'm sorry I don't have a more.
That's great.
I'm a very intuitive writer, so even when we were like talking about, you have to know this about your character, I'm like, I usually figure it out after the first draft. I'm like, so what need are they filling? Oh, we got to work on that. So and maybe that's a good point for writers, is if you are not a big plotter and if you don't build character sheets before you start, that's okay. These are then the questions you ask after you finish the first draft, as you go back and revision and truly like see that relationship again through a new lens and start deepening it and shifting it. Those are my big words of wisdom.
How about you, Angela? How do you build chemistry?
I love to do it through dialogue. Just in my family, we're always bantering. With my friends, I'm always bantering. I'm very single, so if I had a significant other, I think we would be bantering. So like, and usually that's not something I plan. We just tend to like put the characters together and they just go, and I'm like, yeah, okay, this works. So like Intisar, fairly intuitive there, but that's if they can like have a conversation, then I start to see, oh, okay, this is how this is going. This is where this is going.
Yeah. The chemistry of those interactions are,
yeah. And beyond that, it really depends on the characters, because like people are so diverse in what they need and how they connect. So I think characters are as well. So we have these, standards that are more common, but it could be almost anything, that attracts one person to another.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to a lot of what Suzannah was saying earlier about what one character lacks, another one has. I think that creates a very genuine and natural kind of chemistry, because people do tend to seek out the things that they lack, but they also have to be something that's harmonious with that person as well. It can't be just opposites attract, because quite often that's not going to be harmonious, useful, or enduring. So you can still have that. That's still creating chemistry. But if you want it to be long lasting, you need to find something not only that is one person has what the other lacks, but they also have to be, in my mind, similar in some ways to be able to get along well, so that they've got a baseline of similarities while having stuff that the other one lacks. And that way you do create a really good chemistry. But for me, I also tend to do a lot with, like what Angela said, I tend to do a lot of banter, a lot of through conversation, but I try to do just little things as well that are not necessarily for my protagonist to notice, but are for the reader to notice, that speak to the attraction of the other person. Because going back to what was said earlier, I think it was Suzannah that said, you want to see that other person who's not viewpoint is actually interested in this person, as a romantic prospect, as somebody who's interesting and important to them. So just little things like how they will move to cover the space that is usually taken up by the other person and isn't, and that makes them uncomfortable, or the way that they came out a usually very well-dressed and well-presented person who never leaves the house with a hair out of place is suddenly coming out with a button missing or buttoned wrongly. Just little things like that create chemistry, not necessarily just between the characters, but between the reader and the character that we want to be seeing as the romantic interest. So I think the chemistry goes in more directions than one. There has to be that between the characters and through, the various different ways, but you also need that chemistry between the reader and either the point of view character and or your romantic interest, to be able to build that kind of idea that these people are in fact attracted to each other and have good chemistry.
Any thoughts, Stella?
I would say that, so I think of chemistry as emotional excitement, right? Like you feel when these two characters come together, they feel energized, and you as the reader also feel energized, right? Because there's it's interesting when you're trying to write chemistry as opposed to simply sort of experiencing it in real life, is that the chemistry is actually for the reader, right? You can write on the page, right? Like character A and character B felt intensely attracted to each other, but this is nothing for the reader, right? And again,
no, don't tell.
Yeah.
It's about, right, the balance between conflict and attraction, right? So two people who are drawn to each other for whatever reason, but there's something in the way, right? Like I think Pride and Prejudice is the perfect example, right? Like Mr. Darcy can't help but admire Elizabeth Bennet's quick wit and fine eyes, even though he finds her family utterly reprehensible. And so like he's drawn to her even as he's like frantically trying to back himself away. And for me, that's where the energy of chemistry comes from, is in that push and pull.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've got like similar thoughts. And I think, okay, the first thing that really blew my mind and really helped me when I was trying to write chemistry was realizing that there are different sorts of chemistry. You can have chemistry with another person in a way that isn't romantic at all. Like when you meet somebody at a party and it turns out they're also like huge fan of radioactive fungus and you think they're the coolest person ever.
I'm all for the radioactive fungus, thank you.
But there's a huge difference too between romantic chemistry and sexual chemistry. I think sexual chemistry is just a subset of romantic chemistry. And I've read so many books where at first, at least, the only thing drawing the characters together is physical attraction. And like, I'm not going to tell you that's invalid, but there's just one thing in the toolbox. And I think speaking to authors who are like asexual, they've told me it makes a huge difference to them being able to write romance is understanding that it's much more about trust than it is about anything else. And your protagonist wants and needs someone to be intimate and vulnerable with, not just physically, but also emotionally and intellectually. And it's in the conflict between trust and distrust that your romantic subplot will get its energy, like Heather said. And so, for example, in my Miss Sharp's Monsters book, there's a scene where the protagonist and the love interest, he takes her hand. And if I had been trying to write sexual chemistry, I might have like focused on the physical urge to touch one another and the desires that are stirred up when they do, stuff like that. But because I was writing romantic chemistry, I looked for a way to make that moment all about trust. And so it's a comforting moment when he takes her hand. But then it turns out that he's actually holding her hand in order to feel her pulse to see whether she's lying to him about something.
Which is a lovely betrayal of trust.
Which is and there you have the trust, and then you have the breaking of trust, and it's that push-pull. One of the chemistry tips that I learned off Wendy when she was beta reading for me is that if a protagonist is falling for someone, the love interest should occupy their mind. Like I've literally gone through books in edits making sure that my protagonist thinks about the love interest like once per scene, even when especially when they're absent. And like, again, even if you're not writing the love interest point of view, make sure that their words and their actions portray that they are also thinking about the protagonist and gravitating towards them. Mm-hmm. They should provoke unusual emotion in each other, either positive or negative. And then, I thoroughly second what was said about, like, you got to make the audience fall in love with the characters together, which means making the characters be their like best and most lovable and most iconic selves when they are together. Just have fun with it, because when the character's having fun and the author is having fun, then the audience will also be having fun. Yeah. Yep. Even if you're writing darker stuff. Because you still need to sell this romance, right? Even if you're going to pull it away from us and break our hearts, you still got to sell it.
Oh, then you've got to sell it even more, right? Yeah. Like really break the heart.
Otherwise, the ultimate tragedy.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're like, oh, well, we don't really care about them either way. So
yeah.
Yeah. Well, romance really has to mean something then.
Okay. So we do have a bit of time left. Let's move on and say, okay, I'm gonna make this a multiple choice question just in case you don't want to like call anyone out. But
it's gonna be a test on this.
Okay, number one, biggest mistake made in unsuccessful romantic subplots that you've seen, or the biggest thing you've learned yourself about writing romantic subplots. So who hasn't had a chat to go first yet. Wendy, do you want to
Susanna
take this
Susanna
one?
hasn't gone first yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take your own test first.
Okay. Well, I think there are two different big mistakes that I tend to see, and the first one is the failure to prioritize the perspective of the love interest. Like, and this happens a lot with all sorts of writers, but I honestly see it most with male writers writing female love interests. Going back to what I said before, she takes one look at the male protagonist and she's attracted to him. We have no idea why.
Sorry, just the way you said that, you're like, obviously he's like.
Right, you have to know and understand you have to know and communicate the characters' reasons for feeling the way they do. And I think a problem that I see in a lot of romantic subplots is not enough like reasons pulling them apart. And so it's just like, here are these two mildly attractive people. Of course they're going to be together. Well, you need to complicate things a little bit so that and you need to make sure we understand as the readers why they are or are not together.
I think that's why I have a problem with as we were talking about earlier, sexual tension versus romantic tension in subplots, especially sometimes if it's just the sexual tension and there's no undergirdings for it, then it's like, well, why? What reason do we have to believe these people are even compatible? Yes, they find each other attractive, and yes, that's an important thing to find your partner attractive, but it's not the only thing. So for me, that very much ties into what I would find as a really big mistake. I found it in female-led fantasy as well. I do think it's more in male-written fantasy, but I've seen it enough in female-written stuff too to know that it's a universal
It's a general problem. Yeah.
That was going to be my second point, actually. Like, you got to give the romance good and convincing trust chemistry, even if you are focusing hard on sexual chemistry, which, you want to create trust and respect and intimacy on more levels than just the physical.
But I think part of that ties into the fact that as readers, we want to know that this relationship is lasting. Right.
Yeah.
And if you have a relationship that is built on sex, without respect, and no values in common, and those are the folks that are going to get divorced in 6 months.
That's why I have to say this.
Not to be jaded, but that we need more. It needs to have depth to that relationship. And there has to be, I think that's why I keep coming back to respect. And we mentioned it so much here in trust, is because those are the things that help you to value the other person on a deeper level and stick with them when things get tough, which they invariably do in our happily ever afters, right? Like if anyone's ever gotten married, the honeymoon ends pretty quickly, guys. So, I think that that's a really important aspect to me. And I saw you trying to say something, Stella. So what were you going to add?
Oh, yeah. I was just laughing about what Suzanne was saying because it was making. So I'm thinking of actually one particular series, which I won't name, but you may recognize it from my description. This is a hugely best-selling series, so it's like the mouse throwing pebbles at the giant, right? But in book one of this series, there's this romance setup, right, which is it's supposed to be this great epic sort of, right, like she's like the love of his life, and we find out at the beginning that he actually loses her, and so it's supposed to be this great tragic romantic arc, right? As we progress through the book, he begins to meet these other women, and they're just all falling for him. They just, practically kneeling at his feet, right? Because he's just wonderful. He's a great fighter. What?
Main character glamour. So useful.
Yes. And although he has these super strong, instant feelings of love and attraction for the destined one, right? Still, these other women. And as I finished the book and was thinking about going on to book 2, and I was having a conversation with someone else about it, it became apparent to me that he was going to sleep with all of these other women, like not the one, but all of the other women, and that they were the ones with all the sexual chemistry. So I would say, if you're writing like a supreme romantic arc, right, where there's the one, like don't make a member of the couple go off and have like a bunch of other relationships, romantic or sexual, right? Because like maybe you can do one, right? One can work to sort of, you can create, I mean, some different levels of pain and tension with that. But if like your protagonist just sort of like goes off and just sleeps with a bunch of other women and then comes back and says, hello, great love of my life. I just don't buy it, right? I don't buy it. And it turns into a comedy instead of a tragedy. So anyway,
I think.
That's what I would say, like biggest mistake in a in a romantic subplot.
Anyone else have big mistakes to avoid?
I think just giving it time. Like if you're gonna do it, it needs a little time. It needs a little space, depending on how the subplot is, right? But a lot of what's been talked about of like, you know, the insta love and just throwing them together can be avoided if you just like put a little time into it. Personally, I always have trouble. My characters are like doing so many things. I'll realize usually at the end of a draft, oh, they haven't spent any time together actually. So like I have to go back and be like, okay, no, we actually do need time for this to build and they have to spend time together. So just making sure you have those scenes in there. If it's a subplot, find a reason for them to connect.
Yeah, I think when you're writing romance, there'll be a lot more dialogue in the story because the characters need time to actually talk to one another. And you can get so much fun out of the different character interactions. I'm the sort of person who, when I start writing a book, I'm like, what character types will really like play off against each other nicely? And so then I've got like two different weird sorts of character that can just go off at each other, and it's huge fun. But give lots of time for that sort of thing to happen. What about you, Andy? Any thoughts on
just mostly let it happen fairly naturally and don't let it take over the plot as well, because I have trouble, like Angela says, with doing too much so that the characters are doing too much so that they end up not having spent enough time together. One of my early lessons was that I needed to let my characters actually do that because they had to be full people. But on the other hand, you can very quickly fall into the trap of always keeping them apart too much and not giving them enough time together. And obviously the converse to that is you're just making everything about the romance, and so it ends up overwhelming the plot when it wasn't actually meant to be the main plot, and you end up with an unbalanced story. So for me, that'd probably be the biggest things to watch out for. But everybody's going to be different, I think, as to how they write.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes to go before we finish.
Can I give a closing thought? Or do you have?
Please.
I was going to say, one of the things that drives me crazy that you see in a lot of female-led fantasy is the whole, she has to choose between saving the universe and being with him. And it's like, she met him last week. Like, there's plenty of other fish in the sea. I literally was reading a book one night and my husband was next to me and I was so frustrated. I turned to him and I was like, look, if you have to ever choose between saving one person or more and saving me, you better save them. And he looked at me like, is this a trick question? I was like, if it's a 1-to-1, I hope you help me out. But like, otherwise, you need to be helping, and then we get to saving the world or saving the kingdom or saving a whole community. And it's like, this is a dumb question, folks. Like, we need some perspective here. So, Wendy was talking about like the romance taking up like too much. It's becoming too big of a influence in the story. And I think that's where it goes for me, is like, when you get to that point where it's like, save the world to save the boy, it's like, obviously you save the world. So maybe we shouldn't get to this point. We, maybe this is the tragic moment of like, this is what's tearing them apart, right? And it's not a question of who she's going to save, because there are lots of fish in the sea.
Another one.
Even if there isn't another fish for you, we need to save the sea. Like,
I just want you to write this book now, Intisar. Like,
yes, please do. Okay, I don't know if we've got enough time to tackle. We did get one question.
okay.
Does it happen often? And this is probably more a traditional publishing question, but does it happen often that traditional publishers demand a romance plot be inserted or removed for sales reasons? I've heard of it happening in the Hunger Games. It was asked, the author was asked to insert a love triangle because it was selling well in Twilight. So I've heard of that happening. Has anybody else heard of something like that?
I know that, so I have a couple of trad pub books out, and I know that I was asked to try doing certain things, and I was like, no. And they accepted that. So I think it also depends on how hard you double down on it. Usually if it's a contracted book and they're asking you, it's too late for them to back out. So you can do what you think is best. Oh, Suzannah, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think we have just gone to our allotted time. We didn't get quite through all our questions, but I think we hit the main ones. So I'm going to thank you all for listening, and thank you to the panelists for participating. This has been huge fun. I hope listeners have come away with some solid technical pointers. Stick around if you can for the next QuaranCon event, which starts at the top of the hour. It's an in-depth workshop on making magic systems by MD Presley. He's the author of the book World Building for Fantasy Fans and Authors, which I, for one, have found hugely helpful. So I know that workshop will be great. Don't forget to check out the QuaranCon book sale for tons of free books. And I will get everybody to quickly say where listeners can find their books online. Angela.
Yeah, so you can find me on social media or at angelagmarshall.com, and my books are available on Amazon. And audiobook coming soon, actually, but not yet. So,
yay. Intisar?
You can find me at booksbyintisar.com, and my books are there. My social media handle is booksbyintisar, and basically you'll find me everywhere with that. And yeah.
Stella?
Yeah, you can find my website at legendary-magic.com, and my books are available on Amazon in ebook and hard copy.
Indy?
Okay, so you can find me mostly on my Facebook page and group. It's w.r.gingell. I'm on Twitter as well, but I just post nonsense there. I'm also on Discord, but most of the action happens on Facebook page. I do have a YouTube channel as well. You can also find my books on Amazon, Kobo, iBooks, Google Play, basically everywhere that you find ebooks, you can find them. You can find the paperbacks everywhere. And I now have the entire City Between series as of the end of this month, the entire 10 books on audio, and the 2 Monarchies series are coming soon in audio as well. So basically anywhere you find audiobooks, you can find those.
Yeah, and you can find me at SuzannahRowntree.site, that's S-I-T-E, or you can just look me up on Amazon, Kobo, Apple, Google, Barnes & Noble, all the normal places. I've got ebooks, I've got paperbacks, and I now have some Gaslamp audiobooks, which are amazing, I think. Sorry, personal opinion. And yeah, so that's me. And thank you everyone for participating, and we shall say goodbye.
Bye. Thank you all.
bye.
Thanks, everyone.